Hi, this is the Shintaido of America podcast. I'm David Franklin. In Japan, writes Michael Thompson, there were many models to study from. During the short time I practiced with him, I had been most impressed with the younger Egami's style and presence. His was the most artistic approach to teaching I had yet encountered, and it struck a chord in me. But the most common and striking feature of the Japanese teaching style was its depth. The instructors somehow managed to bring you through the surface and into the earth, perhaps because of their intimate connection to their native soil. Master Shintaido instructor Michael Thompson's autobiography, Untying Knots, is full of such episodes of existential unfolding, some disturbing, some light-hearted, all rendered with quiet, dry wit and honesty. That's what I'm going to be reading to you on this, Episode 13, Season 2 of the Shintaido of America podcast, which is what you're listening to, and I'm Shintaido instructor David Franklin, so that's who you're listening to, and Shintaido, in case you haven't heard of it, or you've heard of it but aren't very familiar with it. Personally, I've been practicing this truly amazing form of body movement since 1983. It was invented in Japan in the 1960s by a group of artists, actors, and martial artists. It's dynamic, playful, and creative, a holistic health exercise for all kinds of bodies, and it can be a way to open up to deeper connections with the natural world, within ourselves, and with our communities. No matter your definition of Shintaido, there is no question that it can be intimidating at times, as well as profoundly transformative and rewarding, as you will hear in these chapters of Untying Knots. Untying Knots is Michael Thompson's story of his lifelong encounter with the practice of Shintaido. Michael is one of only 3 master instructors of Shintaido living in the world today and was instrumental in bringing this discipline to North America, in collaboration with the late master instructor Haruyoshi F. Ito. And by the way, if you're just joining us, you can hear previous chapters of Michael's book, in fact, all the previous episodes of this podcast, featuring interviews and other audiobooks, at our website, www.shintaido.org. I'll tell you more about that later, but right now, let's jump into Untying Knots. To remind you, in the previous episode, it's the 1970s, and Michael is in Japan. He attends a workshop where the founder of Shintaido, Hiroyuki Aoki, introduces a new program of softer, gentler movement using the traditional long wooden staff, and feels it to be a historic turning point. Aoki later reveals that Michael is a special project because he's the first instructor who has no previous martial arts experience. He also gains a great insight about his practice from Aoki's wife, Etsuko Aoki. So, with that in mind, here we go. Untying Knots, a Shintaido Chronicle by Michael Thompson. Chapter 17, originally Section 3, Chapter 4 in the printed book. The Queen of Tanzawa. When I attended the Daenshu, or National Workshop, in April, Wendy mentioned that she had been exploring the nearby Tanzawa Mountains on Aoki's recommendation. Since my own interaction with nature in the U.S. was largely limited to national parks and beaches, I determined to ask her to take me along when I got back to Japan and made the appropriate purchases of outdoorsy clothing and so on before leaving. Most of Japan was formed by volcanoes. Its mountains rise suddenly and steeply from the coastal areas. They are, at the same time, accessible and inaccessible. By that, I mean they're easy to get to and difficult to penetrate. About 20 minutes into them, you get the feeling of having left civilization, in particular the mechanized version, far behind. This is in direct contrast with American wilderness, which usually requires hours, if not days, to reach, and when you get there, you will probably encounter some kind of motorized vehicle to disturb your tranquility, since most of my fellow Americans seem to think of nature as a kind of pretty backdrop to their habitual activities. Aoki and the other Shintaido instructors used to tramp around these mountains regularly, and Wendy had probably gone with them at first, but now she was the resident expert guide. The local denizens didn't quite know what to make of her. She was tall, full-figured, and had long red hair. She was famous for walking the streets at night singing Protestant hymns at the top of her lungs. While the foreigners could shrug it off as British eccentricity, the Japanese were not so sanguine. I'm sure many of her neighbors thought she was some kind of restless spirit being. When she went into the mountains, she became even more formidable. When the Japanese engage in recreation, they tend to approach it in much the same way as they do everything else, uniformly. When men went hiking, if they were serious, they would wear tweeds, and if they were amateurs, they would sport some kind of training costume. The same was true of women, although they always hiked in groups in order to encourage each other with cries of "Gambate!" Keep at it, don't give up, even when they were walking on fairly flat terrain. There was often a feeling of facing and meeting a challenge, even when there was none, when the Japanese got together to do sports. Wendy's outfit consisted of sensible British boots, a warm sweater, and a long corduroy skirt. It would be difficult to overstate the amazement, if not awe, she inspired when we encountered other hikers. I, too, was in awe whenever I could catch my breath. She would stride along these paths like Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt. She knew those mountains and its flora and fauna so well it made my head spin to try to assimilate the information I was receiving. She, of course, could sense an approaching storm, and then her focus would move from the surrounding environment to the more goal-oriented task of getting to a safe shelter. When you get to the top of a Japanese mountain, you will usually find a primitive hut where you can stay the night before moving on the next day. I write primitive, but in fact, there's usually someone on hand to provide a cooked meal and even cold beer. She had gotten to know one such person in Tanzawa, and he was always happy to see her and her guests. I can still remember eating Japanese-style curry rice, seated at or under a blanketed table, my feet and legs warmed by hot coals at the bottom of a hole in the floor where our legs dangled, while the top of my body remained in the frozen air of the unheated building. One reason I loved Japan was that it was a country of extremes, and moments like these seemed to capture that trait perfectly. For Wendy and the Japanese Shintaido instructors, the study of Mother Nature was the same as training in the dojo, and I will always appreciate her leading me through this mountain training. You've just been listening to Chapter 17 of Michael Thompson's Untying Knots, and this is the Shintaido of America podcast. I'm Shintaido instructor David Franklin. We're about to hear Chapter 18, but before we get to that, I have a favor to ask. It's not what you think. I'm not going to ask you for money or to subscribe to a paid version of the podcast with bonus material or anything like that. Actually, I am going to ask you for money later, but right now that's not important. What's important is, if you're enjoying today's podcast, the most important thing you can do to help out is to tell people about us. I want to give a big shout out. Okay, not that kind of shout. I want to give a big shout out, that is, a big thank you, to those of you who have already shared the podcast on social media, and also to those of you who are going to share it, which I hope means everybody who can hear the sound of my voice. Also important, a shout out to people who gave us a good rating on whichever podcasting app you're using. That also helps us a lot. So, if you haven't done that yet, it really doesn't take long. It would be great if you could just hit the pause button and do that right now. Just share the podcast on social media and give us a good rating on your podcast app, and then hit play again. I'll wait. Okay, thanks. On with the show. Untying Knots, Chapter 18, which was originally Section 3, Chapter 5 in the printed book. Shoko, Witness to Light. My other big nature experience while in Japan was the meditation with the type of wooden sword called the bokuto. Hey, this is David breaking in to explain that the bokuto is a unique type of straight wooden sword specifically designed by Aoki-sensei, the founder of Shintaido. The shape of the bokuto is distinctly different from the traditional wooden bokken used in some martial arts, though both are derived from the traditional Japanese sword. The Shintaido bokuto is much heavier than a bokken and is not intended for physically striking anything or anybody, but rather as an implement of mind-body training, as we shall see. This meditation with the bokuto is called Shoko, Witness to Light. In the winter of 1981, Aoki taught a course consisting of 4 practices with the wooden sword on successive Sundays. In conjunction with the course, he assigned homework, which was to do either the Shoko meditation or, in the case of newer students, a related meditation called Ageoroshi, which simply means raising and lowering, with the bokuto sword every day for 3 months. In the first case, Shoko, this meant holding the heavy wooden sword out in front of you for an hour, and in the second, Ageoroshi, raising and cutting down with it for the same amount of time. I had experienced this practice in San Francisco with Ito and had found it excruciatingly interesting. Just the fact of standing in one spot and focusing on a spot far in front of you for an hour would have been hard enough, but in Shoko meditation there was the added ingredient of muscular pain and fatigue, which often led to a very strong emotional reaction. I was fortunate to be living near the Tama River, which was the site of some rare uncultivated or uninhabited open fields. My friend and fellow sufferer Tony Hammock, later to become the British head instructor, lived nearby, and we agreed to do part of this practice together. He would take the train to my house, and we would head off to the river, usually around 11 p.m. Since it was winter, we bundled up for the walk, feeling a little guilty because we had heard stories of how, in the old days, they would wear nothing more than their thin cotton gi uniforms, with not even a t-shirt for added protection against the cold. We were not that brave, although we did take off our outer garments and gloves before starting Shoko practice. By the end of the first 3 months, I was to repeat the exercise the following fall, I had gotten something, although it was hard to say exactly what, not frostbite at any rate. I had undeniably established unification of a sort. When we were offered another opportunity, 3 of us responded in the affirmative and were told that we would get private feedback from the resident ninja, Kato. In addition to myself, the other 2 survivors were Masashi Minagawa, who, as far as I know, never stopped practicing this meditation, and Tangawa, a young Keio University student. The latter, who had very little meat on his bones, had, in fact, taken the old stories to heart and had done this practice wearing only his cotton gi uniform. Sadly, he died of heart failure a few years later, not because of this practice, but because he got sucked into the Japanese salaryman corporate lifestyle and literally worked himself to death. I happened to be back in Japan at the time of his death and attended his funeral, which was one of the saddest events I have ever witnessed. He used to refer to himself as the Shintaido good boy during our time together in Tokyo, and he apparently let loose once he changed his environment. He knew no middle ground, which is helpful in the Shoko exercises, but not in all life situations. After the 3 of us had completed our practice under Kato's watchful, if invisible eye, I remember him shivering uncontrollably and trying to help him get warm with some of my excess outer garments. He is another person from that time who is indelibly etched into my memory. The other survivor, Minagawa, used to be the younger Egami's sidekick and ran the head office during the latter's term as head instructor of Shintaido. Egami never did return to the Japanese group from his Mexican sabbatical. He returned to Japan when his father died, and, perhaps feeling that he had been remiss in his performance of filial duties, left Shintaido to rejoin his father's school. Minagawa, who had lived in Egami's shadow for most of his Shintaido career, kept going and now teaches and practices in Bristol, England, where he moved with his wife and children. We often think of each other and our missing comrade when we do movements with the Bokuto sword. One result of this experience is that I became convinced that, although the sword is one of the main components of Japanese culture, it is possible for non-Japanese to imbibe its essence. Hey guys, this is David with just a quick reminder again before we continue. If you've listened this far, you obviously like the podcast, so share the joy. If you're not a big social media user, that's okay. Just email the link to one person who might enjoy it. It's a good way to say hello to your friends. It doesn't cost money, it doesn't take long, and it will help us a lot. Thanks if you've done it already, and thanks in advance if you're just getting to it now because I'm nagging you about it. Okay, enough with the nagging. Back to Michael Thompson's Untying Knots. Untying Knots, Chapter 19, which was originally Section 3, Chapter 6 in the printed book, Aikukan, Philosophical Gleanings. At about the halfway point of my stay in Japan, Aoki unexpectedly returned to the helm of the national organization. Apparently, the whole operation was in danger of collapsing, and he felt he had no choice but to take charge once more. This was not done without criticisms and more defections. The original Rakutenkai group of 30 or so, this was the group that had established Shintaido as a discipline under Aoki's direction, was down to fewer than 10 at this point, and of those, only 2 or 3 were actively teaching in Japan. For the foreigners studying in Japan, this was a godsend, since we were less than inspired by the interim regime. The prospect of studying directly with Aoki on a weekly basis rather than bi-monthly was very exciting. Although he didn't lead every practice session, he was generally present to supervise the Friday and large Sunday group practices. By that time, the international flavor was at its peak, with at least 10 practitioners living and studying in Tokyo, including some new instructors, Robert Briand, Tony Hammock, Jeff Fitch, and Pierre Quetier. Among the others was another American, Ellen Solot, who had an apartment which became a kind of Shintaido salon in the Noborito Komai area of Tokyo, a hub or vortex of Shintaido activity. In truth, Aoki was never very good at keeping a low profile. He would often pop up at practice sessions that he wasn't officially leading and proceed to one of the ubiquitous Tokyo coffee shops where he would hold forth to his captive audience. I have over 50 pages of notes taken from these gatherings and the 10 or so intensive workshops I attended while I was there, and maybe they'll be edited and published. But for now, I will limit myself to summarizing the main points he seemed intent on communicating at the time. At the second or third workshop I attended, he introduced the philosophical concept of Aikukan, the space of love or oneness. This was equivalent to the Zen idea of mu, or emptiness, except that it seemed it was as full as it was empty. He explained that it was all around us and in us, and that if we were attuned, it became a space where we could communicate and interact effortlessly. Of course, as the master Shintaidoist, he felt that it was through the sincere pursuit of the practice of Shintaido that we could best attain the state of preparedness required to enter into this sacred space. He said that when he realized that not only could you enter this world through practice, but you could also bring it into your practice, then everything changed for him. This had happened about 12 years prior. Specifically, with respect to receiving attacks from one or more sparring partners simultaneously, it meant he was linked with them telepathically and could, in effect, read their intentions before their movements began. In this space, he said, there can be no opposition. Even when there is an apparent I versus it conflict, referring to the terms used by philosopher Martin Buber, the it is like a mere rock in a river that cannot block its flow. We all felt we were getting to the heart of Aoki's vision, and I was very surprised when, at a subsequent discussion, he asked me if I thought that the world of zero, emptiness, and oneness, or unification, were the same or different, and why. At the moment, I knew that they were the same, but was only able to mumble some garbled nonsense as to the reason. He quickly intervened to say, "The fact that I asked you the question is what is important." Unfortunately, my left brain or linear self quickly reestablished its primacy, and the moment was lost. But I'm still working on this riddle, or koan, as such puzzles are called in Zen. Along with the changes at the top of the organization came a change in vision concerning the purview of practice itself. Up till then, Aoki explained, their main purpose had been to translate their ideals and philosophies into body movement techniques and codify the results into a coherent system of training. This was carried out, for the most part, by body movement specialists, specifically expert martial artists. But now the emphasis was to be on diffusion or outreach. This meant that the emphasis of practice itself would shift from furnishing an intense experience for a group of insiders to providing a healthy activity for a wider audience. This would lead to a simpler and easier practice, which might be frustrating for veteran practitioners. He added that those seeking to strengthen their faith or purity would have to fall back increasingly on their own resources, through the Shoko exercise, for example. In this context, he stated directly what some of us had assumed, that Shintaido is explicitly not a martial art. It does incorporate martial arts forms in order to help us verify the truth of our movements, or the consequences, as I was to find out. Aoki's artistic drive to create and never rest on his laurels for too long made it difficult for people to follow. Almost immediately, they were enjoined to help hand out pamphlets at cultural centers in the area where they were setting up classes for housewives and retired persons. I attended some of these practices before I left Japan, and was able to see firsthand some of the benefits that a bowdlerized version of Shintaido could bring to an entirely new segment of the population. Along with this change in focus came the flowering of a second branch of the underlying Shintaido structure. It had already been introduced at the Leaders' Workshop in April 1979, and, although I'm not sure it had its official name yet, it was later formally called Yokike Shintaido. The more traditional branch of Shintaido up till then was called Kaihoke, which means a system of training based on opening and broadcasting energy. Yokike, in contrast, means a system of training based on nurturing the life energy, or ki in Japanese. Like all Shintaido techniques, they are based on the positions of the pelvic area, which could be described simplistically as the closed yokitai position, with the belly collapsing and the lower back rounded, or the open kaihotai position, opening the belly and pushing the lower abdomen forward and outward. As I wrote, I was very happy to find that there was another way to go about things. Aoki said that he had discovered the gentler yokike techniques first, but that he had held off introducing it for a couple of reasons. The first was that since the more physically demanding kaihoke, or open system, was harder, no one would want to practice it if there was a choice, and this line of research would be underdeveloped in the long run. The second is related to the first. He felt that the age demanded more open and expressive forms because they encourage active interaction with others and the world around us, rather than leading to introspection and concern with personal development, which the physically less demanding Yokike system might reinforce. But for older or less healthy individuals, there was often no alternative but to start off with the softer forms. He said, by way of illustration, that Yokike was like taking the elevator and Kaihotai was like taking the stairs. These were the main Shintaido-related themes of my stay in Japan, outside of my continuing personal battles. But I was also teaching, and Aoki talked about that at length as well. Chapter 20, which was originally Section 3, Chapter 7 in the printed book, Gorei. Gorei is a Japanese expression with an obvious surface meaning, to count, but suggesting much more. To give Gorei has the flavor of orchestral conducting, and Aoki has said that he studied the techniques of the great classical conductors in the European tradition, such as Furtwängler and Bruno Walter, in order to improve his own conducting when leading a group in Shintaido practice. Along with everything else, I had lost my confidence in my Gorei in San Francisco. It was largely a case of fools rushing in where angels fear to tread. I had started to teach, not only with very limited practice and experience, but also with my main pedagogical model having been Marc Bassis. Since he could never admit to the existence of an invisible world, given his Marxist leanings, his Gorei was one-dimensional, albeit very powerful. Ito, in his usual endearing way, tried to point out the weak points of my teaching technique, but my reaction, predictably, was one of defensiveness and intransigence. In Japan, there were many models to study from. During the short time I practiced with him, I had been impressed with the younger Egami's style and presence. His was the most artistic approach to teaching I had yet encountered, and it struck a chord in me. But the most common and striking feature of the Japanese teaching style in general was its depth. The instructors somehow managed to bring you through the surface and into the earth, perhaps because of their intimate connection to their native soil. I can't resist the temptation to contrast that feeling with some of the scenes I have witnessed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. One is a row of stationary exercise bikes facing a big picture window overlooking the Charles River. The windows are, of course, closed, and the people exercising are breathing recirculated air as they pedal furiously, eyeing the various instruments that tell them how fast they would be going if they were actually riding bikes. The other is the current fad of mall walking, where those interested can power walk around various shopping malls before they open for business. Is there any more striking symbol of the chasm that exists between modern humanity and Mother Nature? Aoki used to say that when he was teaching karate, he could lead as many as 1,000 students in group movement because the movements were so precise and regular. That side also exists in Shintaido, but there is the added dimension of free and spontaneous movements that have to be, if not choreographed, nonetheless directed in some manner. This is especially true in that the safety of the practitioners is paramount. I have been present when he has spectacularly led more than 100 Shintaidoists in a very non-linear practice session, and it was easy to understand his symphonic orchestra analogy. He, of course, gave us many pointers concerning Gorei during this time and after. They have mostly to do with proper preparation, concentration, and intention. Of paramount importance is to ensure the safety of your students, then to help them express themselves as fully as possible, and lastly, to express your own ideas and aspirations. He insisted over and over on the importance of allowing a light to shine in each of your students. My first year or so in Japan was devoted to trying to catch up with my peers and kohai, or junior students, in the Shintaido practice itself, without much thought on the teaching side. But as time went on, I was asked to teach newer people in the large group practice while the others practiced with a more experienced instructor. Teaching Japanese students began to restore my confidence somewhat because, in some way, they made you good. By that, I mean that they were so attentive and so respectful that you had no choice but to reciprocate. I was always very aware that there was a distinct possibility they were according me respect just because of a kind of reflected glory. I had been designated by Aoki or Okada-sensei, one of the original Rakutenkai members who is now the head instructor, merely out of politeness. I believe that there was and is a real danger that foreign instructors in Japan lose sight of this phenomenon. They confuse the respect shown them with personal merit, when in fact the real merit lies with their students. At workshops, I would also be asked to teach sometimes, and this also was a rewarding experience because there would be many participants from groups outside Tokyo who didn't know who I was. I think I usually surprised them, since most had never received a foreigner's Gorei. Once, Aoki invited me to go with him to a workshop at Chuo University, his alma mater. He usually did the circuit of the summer university gatherings and took someone along as an assistant. Since these groups were usually heavy on the martial arts side of Shintaido, especially Chuo, I was surprised that he wanted me to assist, but he insisted that it was much easier to teach them than the people in Tokyo, and I soon was able to verify this judgment. This was a Bojutsu club, Bojutsu being the art of the quarterstaff, about 6 feet or 2 meters long and often made of heavy Japanese oak, and I was to lead the first practice with Aoki on the sidelines. When I arrived, I realized that in my nervousness I had forgotten my bow staff. "Never mind," Aoki said. "They won't notice. You're the sensei." So I proceeded to pantomime the warming-up exercises and to go into the basic exercises, the kihon. Aoki then suggested that I place their club captain in front of the group to lead them while I counted the rhythm, which I did for an hour. The practice ended with everyone exhausted and satisfied, and I don't think anyone did notice that I had forgotten my weapon. At times, I felt as if I were in the tennis scene from Michelangelo Antonioni's film Blow Up, in which two people are playing with a non-existent tennis ball. At one juncture, Aoki decided that the practices in Tokyo had become too flat and formulaic. He announced that anyone who was interested could teach anything he or she wanted for a month of Sundays. As I remember, 2 foreigners and 2 Japanese volunteered. He had asked me to do something similar during a leader's workshop some time before. Actually, he didn't ask me. I had drawn straws with the other instructors and had lost. But I decided to do the entire practice using basic Shintaido forms, but without the arm movements. I was remembering Tom Liebenhardt's mime teacher, who wouldn't allow his students to use facial or hand movements to express their ideas. They had to use their whole bodies. I was hoping that the result would be a stronger and wilder expression, especially since the practice was being held outside at night. The experiment was fairly successful, and Aoki later said he tried to challenge their kiri-oroshi technique, but couldn't. Kiri-oroshi is a freehand movement based on sword movement and Shintaido's trademark Eiko technique, executed while stepping from a standing to a half-kneeling position and accompanied by a strong ki-ai, or vocalization. Aoki was always conscious of the fact that people naturally gravitate toward a routine, even those who think they're terribly original and creative, and that it is good to instigate a small cultural revolution from time to time to counter that tendency. The Gorei I remember best took place at the final annual workshop I attended during that time. I call it my Charlton Heston practice, in reference to Heston's portrayal of Moses in the 1956 film version of the 10 Commandments. It was held at a new location in the mountains, and the weather had been generally lousy and overcast the whole time. I was leading a group consisting of the people I had been working with regularly in Tokyo, plus some university students. The practice had been going on for a while, and we had moved into the open and express phase, which involved a lot of jumping and yelling, when suddenly, and at a particularly poignant time, the clouds lifted, revealing the stunning snow-covered mountains that had been surrounding us the whole time without us, at least those of us who had never been there before, ever knowing it. It was really a very dramatic moment, accompanied by tears, laughter, and embraces. I wouldn't have minded moving on to the next life right then. This is the Shintaido of America podcast. You've just been hearing chapters 19 and 20 of Michael Thompson's book, Untying Knots, and I'm Shintaido instructor David Franklin. We're nearly done, but be sure to listen through to the end of the credits for the cherry. Before the cherry and before the credits, I'm going to pass the hat around among you who are hearing the sound of my voice and do a bit of busking here on the information superhighway. This is the part where I not only nag you again about sharing the podcast on social media, and thank you if you already have, I also ask you for money. Shintaido of America, the producer of this podcast, is a totally member-supported nonprofit organization without any corporate sponsorship. There are no ads on the podcast. There are no large grants from foundations. There's just you, the people, the listeners, and there are many ways to support our truly micro-budget production of educational materials. And I really mean that. We produce a huge amount of content on volunteer power, but some things just require a few bucks in the bank. So, one way is to make a one-time donation in any amount, or another way is to become a member of Shintaido of America for a mere $60 per year, if you're hearing this in 2024. That's just $5 per month, and if you can afford that, it would mean a great deal to our hardworking team. You can do that, sign up for our free email newsletter, and also find all kinds of free educational resources at our website, where you can also find all the previous episodes of this podcast, which is www.shintaido.org. That's www.shintaido.org. That's whiskey.Sierra Hotel India November Tango Alpha India Delta Oscar Romeo Golf. Got it? Our email address is podcast@shintaido.org. And you can also find us on Instagram, on Facebook, and on YouTube by searching for Shintaido of America. Before you hear the cherry, which will really be at the very end, stand by for the cherry. But first, I want to say thanks for listening to the Shintaido of America podcast. Our episode today was recorded and edited by me, David Franklin, with support from Sarah Baker, Connie Borden, Teresa Soldatova, Jim Sterling, the Joe Zawilski's Memorial Fund, and of course, the members of Shintaido of America. Thank you. Contents of this podcast copyright Shintaido of America 2024, with the exception of a short excerpt from the soundtrack of the film Neovoxer, the version recorded at the Oni Gallery in Boston, thanks to Lydia Eccles, created by Michael Pope and the Neovoxer Ensemble, including composer and electric guitarist Troy Kidwell, and featuring Brian Viglione on drums, Valerie Thompson on cello and electric cello, Eric Nugent on pentatonic didgeridoo, invented instruments, and overtone chanting, Michael Knobloch on percussion, David Franklin on acoustic guitar, vocal effects, and live Foley, Michael Pope as bandmaster and on acoustic guitar and vocals, and the late Patty Barkus, rest in peace, on vocals. And here's the cherry.
The problems with the United States aren't, the deep problems aren't going to be changed by a politician. The deep problems of the United States and those that expand across the world really have to be changed by us individually first, and then as a whole group of people.
That was film director and Shintaido practitioner Michael Pope from an interview about Neovoxer, an experimental film and live performance for the Pilsen Finale Film Festival in the Czech Republic in 2004. Shintaido, opening to life.